And you know, well, you may not know, but a gentleman by the name of Paul Watson, who was co-founder of Greenpeace, said that when asked about truth, he said, truth is irrelevant. Truth is what you can get people to believe is truth. That's where you get the spin doctors coming in. That's where you get Satan coming in. You might also remember I used the analogy of the boy who cried wolf, although it had an Australian flavour at the request of the children. It was a boy who cried dingo. But the boy who cried wolf is about the substituting of a lie for the truth, so that the truth is eventually rejected. And as Ellen White said, man is not condemned for believing a lie, but condemned for rejecting the truth. We go to the Garden of Eden. The sin wasn't in eating the fruit, the sin was in accepting Satan's lie and rejecting God's truth. Do not touch. So, climate change, how is that a lie? Well,
back in history,
yeah.
it always gets hotter, it gets cold.
Yeah, it's actually every 172 years, like clockwork, we go through a mini ice age. And that started, according to most geologists and even the astrophysicists, are saying when those planets do that particular thing where the sun cools in that cyclical thing, it started around about 2007, which is why the temperatures are gradually getting colder. And funny enough, that's when they started downplaying the word global warming and started introducing the thing climate change, because it was so obvious you're not getting warmer that they couldn't continue that lie. But where Satan is pushing net zero on your carbon emissions, he's claiming that he's counteracting God's push on net zero for your sin emissions. Although net zero is not a particularly ideal place to get, because if you're on net zero, it means you're still sinning but trying to offset it with good acts. God's concept of zero sin is to repent of it and not do it anymore. But Satan, you know, he can't help himself. He's always got to come up with a twist to things. So the more he pushes the idea of the world coming to a tumultuous end, enveloped in heat, and you've only got to listen to kids. I watch kids and I hear them on the bus, and they're panic-stricken about what's ahead of them. And there's perfectly rational adults carrying on like in a similar fashion. And unfortunately, they're teaching the kids the same thing. While you're on the subject of net zero, we've been to net zero for yonks. Anyone who owns a business knows what net zero means. You're out equals you're in. Our carbon footprint is 417 million tonnes per annum. Our input, or what we absorb, is 940 million tonnes per annum. You add the surrounds of the continental shelf, it goes up to nearly 5 times what we're... So if we want to go to zero, then we should start opening a few more coal mines, because we're in the positive. We're over twice as much absorption, or what they use the term sequestering, the carbon back into the soil, than we're emitting into the atmosphere. So next time we go to Paris, we should ask for a refund, as far as I'm concerned. But Satan himself cannot help it. He must have a lie. He must attack what God... It's not always what's going on in today. What often is happening in today is aimed at the future. So, half a minute. So when we go around preaching the three angels' message, it's not going to resonate, because that three angels' message tells about how loving God is going to end the world, or the end of the world is coming. But because they've been so panic-stricken now with how the world is going to end, and there's no chance unless we stop emitting carbon, the lie is going to supplant the truth. So God's lie has already been Satan's lie has already been accepted, and God's truth is going to be rejected because of Satan's lie. Okay? Thanks. I'll now hand over to Marilyn for the Sabbath lesson. Thank you.
Morning, folks. Who found it a somewhat challenging lesson this week with some of the topics that were covered? Yes, it was pretty heavy stuff, and I think there's some material there that stretches our mind because we're from a different culture. There's some things there that stretch us spiritually because we think, well, how's God going to make anything good out of this? And we are asking some very deep questions in our lesson this week. So let's start with, I think there's my board. Okay, we're going to have a little look at where this all happened and how it all happened to some degree. And we're going to also look at what can we learn from these experiences, because this is a different time frame, a different culture, but there must be some lesson God wants to teach us from these things that have been recorded for us. As an introduction, I just want to point out a couple of things. First of all, I've done 2 lines. I've got man, dysfunction, pain, and sorrow. The story of man's life on planet Earth. Then we've got a line underneath, God's grace, faithfulness, name, covenant promises. And in between, in red, I've got 2 concepts, free will and choice. Now, God had to give us free will so that we are free to make a choice as to how we respond, how we act. Otherwise, we're all robots. So we might look at the stories here and say, whoa, why did God let that happen? And we may stand back and say, why didn't God do such and such in that case? Why did he let those circumstances play out that way? Because he will always respect free will and our choice. That's why our love to God is not because we're forced to love God, it's by our own choice. And we all have that responsibility to use our free will to make healthy choices for our life. And it's another evidence of God's great mercy and love for us. Also, I just want to point out that there are the covenant sons. Let's do a quick rerun of what we've learnt this quarter already. You start with Abraham, the covenant's given to Abraham. Which of his sons got the covenant promise? The son of promise, which was son number 2, as it turns out, biologically. So it wasn't the first son. It wasn't the 6 sons that came after Ishmael. It was, after Isaac, sorry. Now, Isaac has 2 sons. Which one was the covenant son? Jacob. Yes, not Esau, who would have been born minutes before as a twin. Now, from Jacob, he had 12 sons. Which son was the covenant son? It certainly wasn't Reuben. No, he was the firstborn son. Possibly he would have been the covenant son. But who became the covenant son to be the progenitor of Christ? Judah. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, he's in there somewhere. No. Okay, so there's Judah, not Reuben. And we will see in the stories we unpack today possibly why Reuben wasn't the covenant son. Possibly, okay? I haven't read it in black and white, but it's sure glaring. All right, Jacob and Israel. So let's look at Sunday, wrestling with God. I've put the map back up because Jacob had to flee from his brother's hatred, as you know, and the fact that there was going to be revenge. And he fled all the way from down there in Israel, all the way back up to Haran. That's where he met the beautiful Rachel, right there, up there in that top part. So this is where some of the relatives of Abraham were when Abraham left the rest of the clan and he moved with Lot and their wives and they headed down into the land of promise. So, of course, Jacob's delighted to meet his cousin, this beautiful Rachel, and yes, we know the story, and we know how that after 20 years, there's a lot of issues. we find that the cheating that Jacob did with his father that impacted his brother came back with the cheating of his father-in-law and the hatred of his brothers-in-law now, because they're thinking he got rich off them. So it's like what goes around comes around. Have you heard that said before? Well, it certainly did in poor Jacob's experience. Would somebody read Genesis 32 verses 9 to 12, please? And we'll have a quick look at what's happening. Genesis 32 verses 9 to 12, please.
Then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country and to your family, and I will deal well with you. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. For I fear him, lest he come and attack me and the mother with the children. For you said, I will surely treat you well, and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude.
All right. He's told very specifically to go home. So he knows he has God's blessing and God's guidance. He's actually made aware of two companies of angels that travel with him. They had to sneak away from the father-in-law, as you know, and he's desperate, knowing that his brother has not responded in any way kindly to the appeasing presents and messages he sent. He divides the group up. Now, I wonder how the women felt about this. They were divided up almost as how he loved them. Put the handmaids and their 2 kids each, put Leah, the less loved wife, with her 6 boys next, and then last of all, his precious Rachel and her one and only son. Pretty challenging. I know that the ladies would have felt very vulnerable in that position and left to camp there that night, and with him still over the other side of the river. And now it's just Jacob and God. It's just all between the two of them. Now, Jacob had said sorry to his dad before he left home. Did you realise that? They and his father had accepted his saying sorry. He had reaffirmed the covenant promises, but he went out as a fugitive with nothing. Here, 100 years before, his grandfather Abraham came with wives, came with belongings, came with all the animals, came with everything, because they were migrants. Here's Jacob now, a fugitive. Now, as a mental picture of a fugitive, you feel very vulnerable. And that was what he was feeling that night, extremely alone and vulnerable. Now, I don't know if you've ever had anyone attack you. I must admit I have, as a young teenager waiting at a bus stop. I had someone come and attack me, 2 boys actually, with a knife, with an intent. And I think if I was a little less mouthy, I might have got into trouble with this situation. But it was they hit me so hard from behind that my automatic response was to fight back. And I'd never done that before or since, but they hit me that hard. And the vulnerability of that moment of seeing those kids with the knife, knowing that they were intent on mischief, it makes you very, very quick to think. You have to be. You're on your wits now. But here's Jacob now attacked in a very vulnerable mental position and very vulnerable physical situation, and he's going to fight. He's going to fight for his life.
Was he attacked?
No, but his mental perception is, because somebody put a hard hand on his shoulder. You see, we interpret what's happening to us by our emotional reaction. And anyone feeling afraid and vulnerable, their first reaction will be, I've been attacked. Somebody's got me. So we know that Jacob had this enormous struggle for many hours. We seem to think he's one of these sensitive New Age men that was really good at sitting home and making lentil soup. But he was actually a very strong man and able to fight for that many hours. I mean, he must have been pumped with adrenaline to be able to keep that struggle up for that many hours.
But he was in his 90s.
Yeah, well, this is what you're telling me, Doug, and I'm like got a mental picture of someone in their 90s. Let's step back from the scene now and have a look at the behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, Satan had accused Jacob before the angels of God, claiming the right to destroy him because of his sin. And he, that's as in Satan, endeavoured to force upon him a sense of his guilt in order to discourage him and break his hold on God. When Jacob made supplication with tears, the heavenly messenger, in order to try his faith, also reminded him of his sin and endeavoured to escape from him. But Jacob had learned that God is merciful. As he reviewed his life, he was driven almost to despair, but he held fast the angel and with earnest, agonizing cries urged his petition until he prevailed. So instead of fighting him off, he's now hanging on, because he knows that this isn't a normal human being, this is God that he's with. I can't imagine the level of pain he was under with a dislocated hip. My aunt had a shoulder that would dislocate after an accident in the surf. And to get a doctor to come and put it in a home visit was challenging. Some could do it, some couldn't. And she used to end up strapping her arm to her body so it wouldn't go out of joint during the night. And she's a mum with little kids. And I can't imagine how he managed to hang on with the hip out of joint. Terrible. So, had not Jacob previously repented of his sin, and he'd repented to Isaac before he left home, and repented to God in obtaining the birthright by fraud, God could not have mercifully preserved his life. So, Jacob's history is an assurance that God will not cast off those who've been betrayed into sin, but have returned unto him with true repentance. God taught his servant that divine grace alone could give him the blessing he craved. And thus it will be for us in the last days. In all our helpless unworthiness, we must trust the merits of the crucified and risen Saviour. None will ever perish while they do this. Okay. So Jacob's experience testifies to the power of importunate prayer. All who lay hold of God's promises, as did Jacob, and be as earnest and persevering as he was, will succeed as he succeeded. So we see that Jacob went through distress. He tried to appease his brother. He sent presents. He spoke with a very humble message, those messages, and he repeated "my Lord" in reference to his brother, and took a very humble position to reassure his brother that he wasn't coming back to assert his role and take his position. Yes.
I was reading where Jacob set off gifts,
That's right.
and also the people that took the gifts saw that Esau had 400 people with him, and they got scared. They didn't give him the gifts. They went back to Jacob and just reported the 400 people.
That's right.
And so Jacob did not really have any...
No, that's right. So let's read the memory text together, because this is important. Have you got your lesson pamphlets open? It's Genesis 32:28. And he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." Now, it's very interesting that God sent a dream to Laban when he was hot on their heels. He sent a dream to Laban and said, "Don't you speak sweet or not sweet to Jacob," because he knew he could try either way. He could be so palavery that he could try and win him back, or he could be so bully he could try and force him back. So the angel told him, "Don't you speak like that." And now we find that in the case of Esau, God sent another dream
Yeah,
And
that's right.
again, God spoke in
Yeah.
Jacob's defense in a dream.
Yeah.
How powerful are our prayers? If you're struggling with something, you don't know what God's working behind the scenes. And that's why it's so interesting to look at the behind the scenes struggle between good and evil that's going behind for each one of us, working in our experience. All right. The real problem was, and it's brought out in the lesson on Sunday, it's the second last paragraph from the bottom, and that is the error that led to Jacob's sin in obtaining the birthright by fraud was now clearly set before him. He had not trusted God's promises, but had sought by his own efforts to bring about that which God would have accomplished in his own time and way. So they didn't have to cheat, they didn't have to lie, they didn't have to do what they did in the case of Rebecca telling her son, now this is what you've got to do. God's promised you're going to get the birthright. You have to do this. You see how they put human wisdom and human plans and tried to bring about God's will. And in the case of Sarah sending off her husband to the handmaid, it always backfires, and it seriously did in this case. All right, a question for you. Tell me, have you had an experience of wrestling with God in prayer? Just put your hand up. Have you ever had that experience where you have prayed for something and you have agonized? Yes. A number of us have done that. And we know what that feels like. And intercessory prayer is powerful. All right, Monday, the brothers meet. It's very interesting that these two brothers who haven't seen each other for 20 years, how that they now are going to meet. The situation is very different to how it could have been. The two companies are with a desert chief with all his men of war, and Jacob with his tribe of kids, and a number of women, and not to count all the flocks and herds and all the rest of that, and the staff for them. And a very bad limp. That's just where I'm going to, Chris. And a very bad limp. According to Spirit of Prophecy, he was pale and disabled. He really was. He really was in a very, very... But how did he look in his face? Did he look, groaning and moaning? What was he looking like? Yes, peace on his face.
Well, I was just thinking the paleness most probably came from the pain.
Absolutely. Yes.
And a lot of people you meet even today can suffer chronic pain and you won't even know it.
Yes.
Because they can hide it, but you can see it a bit in just the tiredness that's maybe there.
Yes. Pain is very debilitating. And pain of itself, it can be fatal. It's very difficult.
A lot of blood would have been collecting in the area trying to heal.
Sure.
That causes a paleness.
Yes. But you notice how he goes and he bows 7 times. Now that'd be really tricky. If you're using a staff in the place of putting the weight on the leg, to bow down 7 times, he really showed his humility as he came before his brother.
Do you think maybe it caused that brotherly love to rise in Esau too?
Yes.
If he was in pain and it was causing him pain to bow,
Yes.
he did it 7 times.
Yes.
And he wasn't looking angry or
No.
out of sorts. He did it and
Yes.
put himself before
It touched his heart.
before Esau.
Yes.
And it broke down walls.
It did. And like Ellen White said, it even astounded the soldiers.
I don't know if Esau would have known that he wrestled though and had his hip taken
No,
out.
but when he left, he was an able-bodied man, and he comes back, he's got this really bad limp.
Yes.
He doesn't look the same.
Yeah,
It's true. And I've noticed that. If you walk differently, it definitely makes you look different, older. All right, now I've got a question for you. At the bottom of the page there of Monday, it talks about what have you learned about grace. Now, I don't want a great big paragraph. Give me a short 2 or 3 or 4 word description of grace. What you understand grace means to you. First, it's undeserved. All right? Second, it's life-changing. Third, it's empowering. Any other takers for anything else? I've got grace is spiritually enriching power. usually when you say, oh, what's grace? You say it's unmerited favour. No, it's a whole range more of other things. It's like a diamond. It's got many pieces of faces.
I was going to say grace to me is also things like relief. You know,
Yes,
you
lift of a burden.
of a burden.
Yes.
Forgiveness, which gives hope and joy.
Right, very good. I've got, it encompasses all that God's love has done for our salvation. Now that's huge. That's everything that was planned in heaven before sin came on the earth. That's everything that's been put in place since. That's everything that's happened in our personal experience. All those aspects of grace is God's love. How does it work within us? It softens the heart and it purifies our feelings.
It's there to teach.
Teaches us. It provides power to overcome sin and to win souls. So it does a work within us. Grace isn't something that happened on the cross, as much as that's essential. Grace is also personal and what it's doing inside us. All right, let me see if I'm keeping up to my notes. All right, the brothers meet. Firstly, Jacob's forgiven by God and then forgiven by Esau. So amazing that they fall on their necks of each other and they cry. 20 years of pain, 20 years of anger. This is a true forgiveness story. There's humility, there's respect, there's generosity, and there's reconciliation.
It's both ways too.
Both ways. There is no revenge, but as much as there's forgiveness, they will both live separate lives. They're reconciled so that they can meet at a funeral and be together and be brothers and bury their father as they did sometime later, and with no animosity, they can do that at peace. But because Esau had made so many decisions in his life, with the women he married, with the lifestyle he chose, with the fact that he wasn't interested in the faith, it was better for him to take his family and group and whatever and live in a totally different area, because the promised land went to the son who was the covenant son, and that's where he stayed. So that was understood and no problems. And you think, well, does those sort of forgiveness things happen in our day and age? I heard again the other day a testimony by Pastor Louis Torres. I don't know if you've ever heard him live. Just love listening to his stories. Well, I just heard again, his mother Elsa, they were Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico, and they were 6 boys, Louis being one of them, and the mum's best friend, a lady friend, for whatever reason was without a house, so she invited her into the home as much as they were already crowded, and within a very short matter of time, that lady and Mrs. Torres' husband ran off together, leaving her on her own with 6 kids to raise. And she always had such a temper and anger against this woman. She said, if I ever see her, I'm going to tear her eyes out of her face. Scary. And the boys knew she meant it. Ooh. Okay, so Mrs. Torres remarried, and the husband said, look, we'll never get ahead here. He saved up enough money, and he and the 2 boys went to New York. Then he died. The second husband died. So she's got 2 kids living in New York, the rest of the kids living with her. What is she going to do? By working so hard, she got herself and the boys up at the 2 boys in New York. But you know, with a situation like that, the boys went wild. They joined the Puerto Rican gangs. In fact, one of the brothers became the leader of the toughest Puerto Rican gang in New York. And here's this poor mother trying to raise these children. Well, through God's providential grace, the brothers, some of them became Adventists, and including Louis became Adventist. The older brother said, look, I'm going to do a crusade in such and such a city. Why don't you bring Mum, and you and Louis had married by then, come in here and come and preach and give your testimony. Because, I mean, he'd been in Bill Haley's Comets, he had an identity. So lo and behold, there's Louis with the wife and his mother, and who should walk into the door but that woman? 35 years the mother had vowed and declared she was going to get revenge and tear her eyes out. But God's grace worked. Those 2 women saw each other, They ran to each other, they hugged and kissed, and they were reconciled because that woman also had become an Adventist. Isn't God's grace amazing? It's just blows me away how things work out in the end. So forgiveness 35 years later. Now a challenging story for Tuesday. Yeah. Let me just as a little side light, let me go to something. As the archaeologists look through things in the Middle East, they find there's a lot of evidence in documents, written on clay tablets, etc., of certain customs that were done in biblical times that there are records of in other places. So, for example, adopting a relative or a servant to be an heir. Remember Abraham saying, "Oh, Eliezer, he can," or in another one, using a surrogate mother to get children. Again, Abraham's story. These are documented for other people doing those sort of things. And just as an aside, can I tell you, Ukraine has a business in surrogate mothers producing children. And I read one news clip about all these little babies that were all in this centre with nurses looking after them, but the surrogate mothers had dropped off because they were running for their lives, and they dropped off all these babies. And the question is, well, when and how are the new parents going to ever get to these kids to pick them up? So yeah, I mean, I don't know that how many other countries are into having women be surrogate mothers, but certainly Ukraine is. Okay, hospitality to strangers. Again, the story of Abraham and the 3 visitors that came past. Very, very strong Middle Eastern customs and records of it. And I guess, as I look at today's story, honour killings. This is a really tough one. But the interesting things is that Paul uses these stories to teach lessons on faith and on salvation. So listen to this one. This is the surrogate mother one. Galatians 4:31. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. See how Paul's taken that story of what happened and he's applying it to the Christian church and saying, now understand, you are children of the promise. You're children of the child of the faith. Then there's this one for hospitalities, Hebrews 13:2. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Which they did. And then this one, Romans 8:14. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. We are the children of the promise. Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful thought that's where we fit. All right, so I'm going to have a quick look at the situation that happened with Dinah. Being the only girl in the family, I bet she was bored hysterical with all these brothers and what they did with entertaining themselves and being the only girl. But look where things went. She went to meet the girls of the local town. She's flirting with temptation, and that can be relevant for all of us. She had youthful needs of friends, fun activities, purpose and goals. There was an attempt to make things right, but the end of the day was the terrible deception that was planned by the other brothers. Terrible situation. So as much as it looked like Simeon and Levi were trying to stand by the truth and all, they were actually very, very deceived and had been very careful to conceal from Jacob their intentions, and the tidings of their revenge filled him with horror. Heart sick at the deceit and violence of his sons, he only said, "You have troubled me to make me stink." Jacob felt that there was cause for deep humiliation. Cruelty and falsehood were manifest in the character of his sons. So Jacob was bowed down with trouble, and the Lord directed him to journey southward back down to Bethel. There was a need to do some serious spiritual talking with the family.
I was just thinking on that and meditating the name that they created for themselves.
Yes.
You know, it's about, if you think about in our time, those Seventh-day Adventists, you can't trust them.
Yes.
They'll double cross you.
Yes.
You know, like their word doesn't matter. And this is kind of the the image or the name that they were giving the surrounding nations of God's people.
Yes. Yes.
And that's very sad, you know.
It is
to
sad.
think about that.
It is.
And then also you see a progression, because this happened before Joseph's incident. And so no wonder they were willing to even kill their brother
Exactly.
and sell him off. Look how they treated these.
That's right. It was the same key characters that did the Joseph thing. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, the thing is, you can understand wanting revenge on Hamor, the son that violated Shechem. But
Yes.
it wasn't just on him.
Exactly.
It was on every male of the city.
Yes. Very, very.
But this is after they repented, after they've already gone through circumcision to become part of
Exactly.
God's people.
Yes.
Yeah, well,
And
the issue was,
they wanted to do right by their
it's interesting in verse 19 it says that this young man was more honourable than all the rest of their household.
Yes.
Yes.
I
Yes.
mean, he made a mistake.
Terrible.
He did the wrong thing,
Yes.
but he wanted to make it right.
Yes.
And the difference in this story is also you don't get the idea that he forced her. So like in the case of Tamar with
Yes,
her brother,
definitely.
it says there was force.
Yes, that's
So
right.
in this case, they must have liked each other too. And I often think, what was it like for Dinah afterwards?
Yeah, exactly. I've thought the same. How does she live with that?
So
Yes.
there is a key point that's made in 31 after Jacob has somewhat rebuked.
Yes.
And they said, should he deal with our sister as with an harlot? Now, the issue is there was problems with what took place as far as God's people were
Oh,
concerned.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Then the next problem is that they weren't faithful in being honourable to those, they were deceptive.
That's right.
Then tried to carry out their honour.
Yes.
Cowardice for
So
starters.
verse 31 then is just trying to justify what they did.
Exactly.
Yes, that's right.
They
They
felt-
wouldn't
they
take
felt
reproof
that
from
they
their
had a-
father for it.
They were making that they had a precedent for their behaviour, but it was not
Yes.
the case. They had a precedent for dealing with the situation and saying, no, this is not meant to be done,
Yes.
but not in being deceptive,
Right.
not in doing what they did. They had a precedent to say, no, they could have said, no, this is not to be done, we don't want you to have this part. But they
Yes.
didn't. They said, no, okay, this is how we're going to do it.
And this is evil for evil, or should we say, revenge often tries to do worse than was done to them.
Well, it's all about don't mess with me.
It's you know, it will go will take it further. I mean, the Old Testament says eye for an eye and a tooth for the tooth, because of human nature is that if you do something to me, I'll do something twice as bad to you. And this is exactly what's happened. When we were in New Guinea doing the Revelation seminars, I was at the Teachers College, which was a boarding institution, and it had students from all over PNG. And we went through the gate, and there were security guards at the gate. And we said, okay, so why the security guards? They said, because if something happens up in the highlands and there is an incident up there and they can't do the payback to the closest relative living there, the revenger will come all the way down to the coast to Madang and track down some young innocent person who's related to the person that was up in the highlands. So they had to have security guards at the gate. And this is going back a long time ago, because the payback situation is so strong in that environment. So it's terrible. It never stops. And you can imagine how difficult this was for the father. Again and again we see deceit and deception. I'm looking at the bottom of the page, as well as acts of kindness and grace in these accounts. What does this tell us about human nature? I'm telling you I'll put down two texts. Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? So who would know what's in the bottom of their heart if you were pushed to that level? At what level would you say enough is enough? How would you respond in those circumstances? And yet there's God's grace. Isaiah 1:18. Come now and let us reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. So God's grace. And we know in the story of Joseph many years later, he knew that his brothers were converted men when they came down as adults to buy grain. He tested them. He tested to see if they hated Benjamin like they hated him. He put the worst criminal out of all of them in jail. He was the one that was held in the prison while the brothers went back to get the the money to come and get more. All right. Prevailing idolatry. We know that there's idolatry in this family because Rachel stole her father's images. If you read back the story, they're called the teraphim. These are household gods that were usually possessed by the head of the home or the head of the clan. They could be little tiny things, this small, or they could be life-size. And they were used for divination, and therefore in the Bible they would be grouped with mediums and, we're fortune-telling and getting the future, and so they had to be removed. So they were in Rachel's saddlebag from the camel when her father went round and felt all round the tent to see where his household gods were. Exactly. So Jacob knew there were false gods in the camp, and idolatry had to some extent gained a foothold even in his household. So they may have picked up gods from around the traps where they were living, and most likely picked up some when they did that raid on that city and wiped out all those poor men. So there was need of a huge change in what was happening. So what does Jacob do? God tells him they need to go back to Bethel, and with deep emotion, Jacob gave his testimony. The family needed to hear his personal testimony again. And he talked about being a lonely exile, fleeing for his life, and how God had appeared to him in a night vision. And as he talked about how God had dealt with him, his own heart was softened, and his children also were touched by a subduing power. He had taken the most effectual way to prepare them to join in the worship of God when they should arrive at Bethel. So God renews the covenant with them there at Bethel. After all this terrible disaster and mess, God still renews the covenant. But we have to be aware that idolatry can sneak into our hearts. It can come in all different shapes and forms. You know where it is, where the devil finds your weak spots, but fight it off. You don't want the idolatry in your life. I want to talk now about the death of Rachel. I think this is important because there's some practical issues I want to talk to that. The death of a mother in childbirth is what you would call an unexpected death. It's very hard on the family, terribly traumatic for the nursing staff, because you're looking at welcoming life and not looking at a death. Very, very difficult. It doesn't perhaps happen so often in our culture now, in our country, because of all the medical whiz-bang stuff they've got, but certainly it happens in other undeveloped countries. And when we were in VIA, there was a young father that brought his wife and young children down to one of the city hospitals because she was going to deliver her baby. The baby was delivered safely. I think the father got to see the mother and the new baby. Then he went back to where they were staying to look after the other kids. That poor mother lay in that bed and slowly hemorrhaged to death because all the nurses had gone to have a sleep. So next morning he comes in and the wife's dead. We sort of, our minds sort of struggle with that. And I'm presuming that something like that happened with Rachel, because as her strength was fading and she was probably getting close to losing consciousness, she wanted to name that child that she just delivered, that poor dear soul. So unexpected death is a terrible tragedy because we don't expect to bury our children. We don't expect to bury our wife after childbirth. We expect to live a good long life and reach old age. So then what can we learn from this? Well, there's a number of things. Pastor Mike Tucker's testimony of how he coped after the death of his wife of 40 years says that in the few weeks that they had left before she passed, they talked about things that were important, and she wanted him to live with no regrets. She knew that in his grieving process, he would go back in his memory and remember times when he'd been harsh with his words, when he'd snapped at her, when he'd been impatient, and because he had an anger issue from his childhood and in their early married life, that was very obvious. She was a very calm and came from a beautiful family, but that was hurtful to her, and he knew it. And she was smart enough to recognise that as he was going through the grieving journey, he would remember the times when he was a failure to her. So she said, I want you to live with no regrets. She wanted to give some last words of counsel to her children. So she's had a stroke because of the cancer had sent blood clots and all this sort of stuff. So he was her secretary and wrote out letters to all the children and grandchildren that they would read later down the track. She said to him, live our life. They'd been so busy with serving God in ministry, going around teaching. They were so involved with their church and their family. She says, live our life. Do the things that were meaningful and important to us. And that was hard for him after she was gone. It was very hard for him to get up in the pulpit and preach a sermon a month after she died. He didn't know whether he could do it without breaking down. It was hard for him to go back to some of their favourite places where they'd gone for holidays or meals. He sat there and cried buckets. But at the end of it, he knew he'd done it and he'd survived, and that was all part of his healing journey. And so thirdly for us, we need to be thanking and being present for people and being caring for people while we're alive so we don't have regrets. Make sure we do our diligence now in making things right with people while we can. And we can be living knowing that we're all good with life. And then when we come to do the grief journey, it's not the same for everybody. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote the first book on this topic, stepped it out in steps from denial through to acceptance. And there's a number of steps in between, one of those being anger, one of those being bargaining, there's another one. There's a number of steps, but not everybody does all the steps. Some people have it shorter. If you have unresolved issues and anger, you can have what's called complicated grief. That means you can come to the time and recognise that there's things that you should have said that you had maybe opportunities to say that you never said and you never can say because that person's gone. So this is why I'm saying to you, be thinking on what, asking, praying to God, is there anything I need to make right that needs to be said and needs to be done now? Because I don't want the experience of complicated grief, because it slows down the grieving process and makes it harder to get through to that final stage of acceptance. And fourthly, and most importantly of all, develop trust in God that He is good. No matter what happens in life, don't let that shake your confidence in God. Have those promises of God firmly embedded in your mind, because when you're flat with grief, that'll be your go-to, because you'll be too mentally strung to be able to do deep Bible study, to be able to have intense Bible discussions with people. You will need to have those resources already embedded in your brain. So you won't say, oh, where was God when this happened? Why is this happening to me? I don't know why everything bad happens in my life. It's useless. I might as well give up on Christianity. You see how the devil can pull you away from your faith. You may be flat out. You may be exhausted. You may need to live on the prayers and the care of your friends around you. But don't lose your faith. And remember, God is good. We may not understand the terrible things that happen and are even reported in the Bible because of the dysfunctionality of sin, but we can, as Christians, be as strong and as prepared as we can be. Loving Jesus, you're so merciful to us. We struggle with the sin that's in this world, that's rampant, that's causing so much grief and pain and terrible things to happen. But we know above it all, you are good, and that your plan is to come back soon and to clean this filthy earth and save us and take us home to heaven. Help us to do the part that we need to be doing now to be ready for when you come. Amen.